Chapter 4. What can you tell me about a group of operators that recently entered the island? I'm unsure about the group's total size, but I've seen at least 5. They were using tranquilizer pistols, possibly purchased here on the island. Rip listed out the rest of the details that he could remember from the encounter. Jesse tapped his fingers on the top of the desk, thinking over how he wanted to answer. I know the group you are talking about. They arrived a week ago with all of their own armor, from what I have been led to believe. The weapons they use, however, were all procured through a local contact of theirs. His lips twitched downward, displeased at being cut out of an arms deal on his island. If you have a conflict with them, then I might be able to give you a discount on whatever hardware you purchase. You should know, however, that the group is associated with a larger, far more dangerous piece of the underworld. Rip felt his eyes sharpen at that. Which underworld are we talking about exactly? The underworld, he used his fingers to provide quotation marks. Or the underworld of terrorists and the like? The latter. Good, the former would have complicated things. Quite. Are they hired guns or a cell group? Yes to both. They are part of a larger cell group that, in turn, belongs to a terrorist organization, but they also operate as hired guns when the price is right. Which, from what I have gathered, was the case for the job that brought them to this island. The group they are formally a part of has no plans for this island. Which only leaves one option. I assume if I attack them, though, it will put me on the larger cell group's radar. Rip ran a hand down his face with a sigh. The situation was getting far more complicated than either he or Max had originally imagined it to be. Whatever was going on, he doubted that this was a simple kidnapping. No one hired a mercenary group to accomplish that, especially not one like this. You hired local thugs, not people who worked with warlords or whatever. He had no idea of this group's skill level. Maybe this was all they were good for. Can you find out who hired them? I have no choice but to pursue the matter to completion. They took someone precious to me. When I'm done with this, I'm going to need to know as much information as you can give me. Who hired them, why and where they came from, in case they might have met the client. If I'm going to be on some terrorist organization's hit list, then whoever organized this is going to be on mine. Jesse leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face and his elbows resting on his chest. I can try to find out who hired them, but it won't come cheap. I'll need to call in some favors, and if you had hoped to stay off your government's radar, you can kiss that thought goodbye. Dealing with groups that have connections, and the even more well-connected people that can afford to hire them, comes with risks and consequences of their own. What do you say? I don't have a government like that. Any allegiance I might have once developed died when they left me to rot in a foreign country as a child. Rip's voice had taken on a hard, ice-cold edge. Patriotism is for those who haven't seen the reality of the world yet. Every government is simply a giant mega-corporation that has given itself power over people's lives. If I need to, I'll work for a corporation, but they won't own me. They lost that right a long time ago. The weapons dealer gave him a long, penetrating stare. There's a story there, one that I admit I'm curious to hear. He sighed and tipped back towards the desk. But I understand that you're on a timeline, and I can respect that for now. He reached into the desk and pulled out a thin laptop that he began rapidly typing on. Let's see. There was a brief pause as he read through some information on the screen. It looks like the group came to the island with a small unit of 10 people and 2 vehicles using the public ferry. The shocks were reportedly compressed on one of them when it was driven off the boat, so it was likely loaded with their gear. It was also thoroughly inspected by the officials when it was unloaded. I have a list of the weapons they purchased on arrival, and an idea of their overall equipment, outside of what they've been seen carrying. The sound of a printer going to work came from the bottom corner of his desk. I'll print out a sheet with that information, along with the location of the business they have rented out during their stay. It was more inconspicuous to rent an empty business building and act like you were moving in than it was to take over an entire warehouse. Really, it just depended on how much foot traffic there was in an area. What kind of body armor do you have? Rip asked when he heard the odds. Jesse snorted. This isn't the movies, kid. Your best body armor is not getting hit. No duh, he returned with a roll of his eyes. I also know that isn't always an option, though. Now, I'm sure you have access to something that'll keep me alive when I do get hit. What is it? Against that many people, it was a matter of when, not if, he would get hit. The max number he would be able to take out even semi-quietly was 3, and that was if he was lucky. These were trained professionals, not local goons from some untrained gang like the idiots cooling on the floor behind him. The fact of the matter was that he was out of practice, and his skills were more than a little rusty. That number could be higher, but it would likely be lower. You realize that all of what you are asking for is going to be expensive, even with the discount, right? How much will the funds from my exceedingly generous benefactors cover? He pointed his thumb at the bodies. They prepaid, right? Jesse blinked in surprise and began to laugh. I suppose we could go that route. If anyone asks, I'll just put the blame on you. They'll be coming after you, anyway. So you might want to leave right after this is done, assuming that you survive, of course. He looked up at the ceiling and did some mental math. With what they paid me, I could provide you with an armored shirt. It's a special woven material, don't ask me how it's made. Or what it's made of, because I have no idea. It's equivalent to a modified version of the Americans' Type 4 military rating for armor. You'll still feel the impacts. There is no getting around that. There is only a little impact dispersion, so be careful. It is a little on the thin side, though the weaving is so tight you'll still get hot in it real quick. Listen, this thing is not available on the street. I'm only letting you use it strictly as a favor because of what you are attempting to do. I need it back at the end, no matter the condition it's in. Rip agreed without hesitation. If the plumber was willing to go out on a limb for him like this, then he wasn't going to object. Along with that, I can provide you with a rifle and a suppressor for the pistol you took from them. You'll need to cover the debt for all the information I have already, and will be providing, along with the escape route from the island that I'm sure you'll be needing when this is over. You seem confident that I'll succeed. You forget, I just saw you take down 7 guys without breaking a sweat. 7 untrained goons is a lot different from 10 trained professionals. He pointed out. You've made your point though. Your money will be ready by the time I get back. He stopped. Wait, how much are we actually talking about here? With the discount still applied, $40,000 without 60. What the foo? Rip shook his head, unable to even finish the exclamation. What kind of favors are you calling in? I told you, the expensive kind. I'll say. Whatever, I'll have the money. He assured him, praying that Max had already begun the transfer of funds he had promised him. Good, I'm doing this outside my normal manner, so we'll hold off on that part of the transaction until your return then. Jesse stood and gently pushed his 2 bodyguards to the side, away from the wall behind them. Come, let us get your equipment and then you can be on your way. He pushed a hidden button on the underside of a picture, which in turn slid to the floor to reveal a keypad and thumbprint reader. Jesse carefully covered Rip's view of the pad with his body, and entered a long series of numbers into it. There was a soft whir of machinery from behind the wall, as something moved into place. Then with a click, a section of the wall on each side of the painting slid to the side, revealing a rack of weaponry on one side and armor on the other. Do you have that on a carousel of some sort? Rip asked, daring to step around the desk. Different codes activate different personalized setups or something? It would be an excellent way to save space, while also keeping certain merchandise hidden from people. Oh, you've seen one of these before. Only for shoes. Never for weapons and armor, but I like the idea. Let me see the gun you got from them, would ya? Jesse requested with a chuckle. Shoes, huh? I've seen those on TV as well. Rich people are weird. Rip retrieved the gun from his bag and carefully handed it over to him after making sure it was unloaded. I was originally just going to give you a suppressor for this, but the barrel isn't threaded, so that won't work. You'll need a different gun. He pulled out one with an attachment already fitted to it. Rip had been out of the game long enough that he didn't recognize the newer models of handguns. However, he did recognize the brand and the caliber it was using. It was a high .45 caliber affair that was metal and fairly blocky in appearance. It was plain to see that while it wasn't exactly a high-quality piece of hardware, it was still far better than some cheaply made plastic affair. The quality of this one was much higher than the crappy one he had taken from the gangster. He had at least heard of the brand, and while he knew people liked to talk smack about them, they were generally fairly reliable in his experience. They weren't great, and they were a budget brand to be sure, but they also weren't as terrible as people liked to say they were. This one came with a badly abused rail on the bottom that couldn't have held a light if it had wanted to. Jesse included 4 spare, loaded magazines for it that he set on the top of his desk. Is there a particular model of semi-automatic or rifle you would prefer? Like most child soldiers, he had been trained on the cheapest and most durable weapons the group could buy. He didn't need the reminder of who he used to be and risk awakening the inner beast again. The AK assault rifles might have been a good standby, but it wasn't all he knew how to use. How about that Smith & Wesson, the M&P 15? I've used that one before, even if it has been a while, he said, pointing to the familiar gun. Jesse pulled the rifle from the rack with a raised brow. That's supposed to be a military and police-issue weapon. Rip snorted and began inspecting the unchambered rifle. Hardly, and you of all people should know better than that. All that designation means is that it's about as common as they come, but you already know that. The weapons dealer held up his hands and grinned in defeat. Fine, can't blame a guy for snooping. He pointed to a single shirt hanging from a large metal hanger in the opposite opening. That's the bulletproof armored shirt. Let's make sure it fits. Rip pulled it out with a soft exclamation of surprise. As a shirt it was heavy, as armor it was ridiculously light. This doesn't feel like it would even stop a .22 caliber round. As I said, it uses a new weave and thread tech. There are none of the usual ceramic plates for weight or Kevlar involved at all. He set everything for the rifle, along with a few full spare magazines for it on his desk. Pulling off his jacket, Rip unzipped the armored shirt and then looked at his own shirt before taking it off as well. The armor was tight enough that it was meant to be worn underneath any other clothes. It would need to be washed after this, but that was standard procedure. Jesse inhaled sharply as he saw all the scars covering Rip's back, chest and sides. You have lived a very interesting life, for one so young. I thought that he was just telling stories. Rip looked at him sharply, but let the momentary slip of the tongue pass. He could worry about it later, when he wasn't on a deadline. Though if the man did know of him, it would explain a few things. Interesting is one word for it. Certainly not the one I'd use, but it's definitely a word. He muttered, struggling to zip up the side. What word would you use instead? Jesse asked, batting his hands away to take over. The shirt was a half size too small, and just wouldn't go up all the way, no matter how much they tried to force it. Eventually, they simply gave up and flipped the Velcro flap that ran its length over the open portion, using that to hold it shut instead. Painful. Huh, I suppose that would work as well. Don't get shot on either side where the zippers are, especially not where it's open. You might be surprised to learn that armor only protects the areas that it is covering. Jesse pointed to everything on his desk and the sheet of information he had printed out. That should be everything for now. Go wage your personal war before they get prepared for you, or move whoever they took. Then come back with my money, and I'll have some more information and a way off the island for you. Thanks, Jesse, and for what's worth, I hope you lending this to me doesn't get you in trouble with your bosses. Would it make a difference if it did? No, I have a feeling I'm going to need it. As plumbers go, you've been nicer and more professional than the vast majority I've had to deal with in the past. It's rare, that's all. Rip carefully packed everything into his bag, using his jacket to disguise what stuck out the top. I'll see you in a few hours. He unlocked the door and left without a backward glance. The deal with the plumber was done. Now it was time to get Ashley back. Chapter 5. The taxi dropped Rip off about a block from the address Jesse had given him. Given the late hour, the entire street was deserted, and all the businesses, the few that still remained, were closed for the night. This was not a section of the island that tourists were seen visiting very often. It was as he was strapping on the thigh holster and magazine belt that it occurred to Rip there was one important thing he had forgotten to bring. A flashlight. Walking down the street where there was light from the street lamps would be possible, but entering any of the back alleys would be impossible. He could use the light on his phone, but if he had to use the pistol, it would be somewhat awkward, not to mention it would be putting a target directly on him. Cursing under his breath, Rip couldn't believe he had forgotten something so crucial and obvious. It was a sign of just how out of practice with all of this he really was. Granted, this part of the operation had never been his forte anyway. He was closer to an assassin or a hitman than anything even remotely approaching an infiltration specialist. However, as he had gotten older and still been alive, the group had forcefully trained him in a few different things. One of the few times they had given him training without him seeking it out on his own. Many of them had later regretted giving him that training. He had made sure of that. Not that it was enough to help him escape. He was grateful for that additional training now. It was how he had known about the plumbers and how to find them. He knew more as well. The group had thought he was brainwashed to their cause by that point, and was one of them. That he would stay with them. He had thoroughly proven them wrong, not that it had been easy. Rip breathed in deep, the action settling his nerves before beginning the rescue mission. He sent off a quick text to Max with all the information he had gathered and how much money they were going to need. Then he placed his phone on silent and began creeping toward the building where Ashley was supposedly being held. The first step was simply confirming whether or not she was even in there. He chose each step with care as he walked away from the street and into the darkness that clung to the buildings on that side of the street. He was still half a block away when he heard the first whispers of conversation. There was definitely someone out there, and judging by how loud they were being, someone who wasn't expecting company. The question was whether it was the people he was looking for, or some random drunks wandering around in the night. Rip carefully drew the gun from the holster on his thigh. Even if there was no one else around, he didn't really want to use the weapon. Suppressors were nowhere near as quiet as they appeared to be on TV and in the movies. They still put out enough noise to alert anyone close by. It was a different matter entirely if the gun was built with that purpose in mind and used a wipe system that further concealed the noise of the gases, along with the suppressor. Then they were much quieter. However, that wasn't what he had. What he had was a typical gun with a suppressor attached to it, nothing special, in other words. He also had a knife and the telescoping baton for any close-up encounters. Those came with risks of their own. It was an assumption that he could overpower the other person and was a better and more skilled fighter. While he liked to think of himself as a decent hand-to-hand fighter, it was never his first choice. There were too many people out there who had received more specialized training in the subjects than he had. People who weren't nearly as rusty in performing the moves either. The only advantage he had was his willingness to fight dirty and the ability to think outside the box as a result of how he had been trained. Sticking to the darkness, he stopped in the doorway of the building next to the one Ashley might be held in and waited. The voices of the two people talking came and went on the soft breeze as they came closer to the entrance of the alley. Rip fingered the knife he had taken from the gangsters in Jess's office. It was a large hunting blade affair that was terribly weighted for throwing, but had a decent edge. For what he had in mind, though, it didn't matter if the knife hit properly. The weight behind the blow was more important. Carefully, he opened the baton and then crept toward the edge of the building at a crouch, remaining low and out of sight. In his dark clothes, he would appear as part of the shadows if they even saw him at all. The beam of a red-tinted flashlight swung over the opening of the alley as the two chatting men drew close. At last, he could finally clearly hear what they were saying. "Why are we out here patrolling again? The boss personally put the note in the boyfriend's shirt. Does he think that kid is going to come after us or something? How should I know? We both just take orders. He probably just wants to be careful. The money this girl is going to bring in, I heard, is huge, though I'm pretty sure the people who hired us for this job have something else in mind." "Like what?" A second red flashlight beam joined the first. The red beam was less harsh on the eyes in the dark and helped to preserve a person's natural ability to see in the dark. It was smart of the mercenaries to be using them instead of regular flashlights. You got less detail with the light, but the trade-off in Rip's opinion was worth it. Of course, the downside of using a flashlight was still there, no matter what. It revealed your position. "No idea. It's not our place to know. The boss might, but I doubt anyone else would." Rip had heard enough. It sounded as though Ashley was merely being used as a pawn for something more. He'd need to have a conversation with the boss man after he rescued her. That meant he couldn't kill everyone, not right away at least. A feral grin crept onto his face. It had been a while since he last tortured someone. It might be fun to excise some more inner demons and let that part of himself loose for a little while. It was a slippery slope, but if it meant keeping her safe, he'd gladly strap on some skis and bomb a run or two at full speed. He readied the knife and waited for them to appear. It only took another couple of seconds for them to walk into view and then pass by where he was hiding. That was what he had been waiting for. The knife sailed through the air and smacked the man on the left at the base of his skull. With how badly weighted the hunting knife was, Rip had never hoped for the blade to be what hit him. Instead, he had been more realistic and knew that it would be the hilt or the backside of the long blade as it turned. In this case, it was the weighted hilt that cracked into the bottom of the man's skull and sent him tumbling to the ground. Jumping out of his place in the shadows, Rip swung the baton and cracked it against the second man's jaw, who had just begun to turn toward him. The blow instantly broke and dislocated the jaw, sending him to the ground. He quickly hit him with the baton 2 more times and then switched to the other man and repeated the action, making sure he was unconscious. Picking up the knife, he quickly ran the blade across both of their necks, silencing them forever. He could have kept them alive to question, but the chances of them making a noise were too great. It was better to go in blind and keep the other side unaware of his presence for a little longer. Searching their bodies, Rip was able to find some magazines for their guns. They wouldn't fit his rifle, but the ammunition was the same, so he stuck them in his backpack just in case. He could transfer the ammo over later if he ran out. It was an unlikely scenario, but he liked being prepared. He grabbed both flashlights and then continued searching them. They both had small radios that had been muted, and tranquilizer pistols, which he grabbed gleefully. The darts would be much quieter than his own pistol, and make the odds of him going undetected for a little longer higher. The last thing he did was drag both bodies back into the dark alley they had come from. It wasn't the most secretive of places, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to keep the eyes of any casual passerby from noticing them. Rip stored the second flashlight and radio in his bag, and then tucked the second dart gun in the back of his pants. Collecting everything that he could from his enemies was a bad habit that remained from his childhood. Back then, his life had often depended on salvaging everything he could from the fallen: clothes, money, weapons, and food. Nothing was sacred once someone was dead. They no longer had a use for it, and he might, whether that was for staying alive or selling later. The dead didn't care, or if they did, they had never said anything to him about it. Chapter 6. Rip unmuted the radio and clipped it to his shirt, keeping the volume low so the sound wouldn't carry. There wasn't a lot of chatter going on across the channel, with people checking in every 30 seconds. That meant he wouldn't have long before they realized the two men were no longer checking in. Of course, that was dependent on whether they had even been properly checking in with the others in the first place. The radios had been on mute when he came across them, so they may not have been. Either way, it was best to not assume anything and to keep pushing forward. Using the red lens on the flashlight, he hurried to the back of the building. There he found another two mercenaries waiting by the back door. These ones were more alert than the first two, and were standing at the ready without even chatting. There was a tenseness to how they were holding themselves that Rip took to mean that they'd recently had an argument. It could have also meant they knew someone was out there and coming for them, but they weren't looking around wearily, merely standing at the ready. They were doing their job, but not well. It was about the quality of work he had come to expect from people associated with terrorist groups. The training they received was always lackluster, especially in the beginning. It seemed that only the people who survived received truly decent training. He had been expecting something more from these people because they were considered mainly a mercenary group. It seemed like their roots were too strong for the rank-and-file members to forget. They were undisciplined and barely trained in the ways that mattered the most. It was a realization that had Rip's nerves settling a fraction more. It took little skill to ambush someone in the dark in the middle of the road when they weren't expecting it. The efficiency with which they had operated had still inflated his expectations of their abilities. It was possible they had skills in a firefight. That was usually what these sorts of people were trained to do. Everything else would be of middling quality for the average member. There were bound to be at least a few people who had gotten more training than the rest. If he was lucky, then he would be able to take out another couple of them before meeting one of those. Taking a deep breath, he aimed the dart gun at the closest guard's head and pulled the trigger. The quiet thwip of compressed air being expelled from the barrel alerted both men by the door. It was the downfall of these sorts of guns that most people rarely thought about. The same thing had happened earlier that night when they had been used against him and Ashley. No matter how quiet the gun was, if it was close enough when fired and the area was quiet enough, then it could still be heard by the target. In this case, he would have needed to be double the distance to avoid being heard. If they had been talking, or even better arguing, then that would have worked as well. At double the distance with a dart gun, the risk of missing increased exponentially. The model these men had was, without a doubt, primarily made for close-range operations. Switching from the first guard, Rip took aim at the second man and pulled the trigger. He was pleased to see the small dart hit and sink into his cheek and take hold. It wasn't as good of a placement as the neck, but almost anywhere on the head was prime real estate for a knockout dart. Just to be sure though, he fired again and then turned his attention back to the first guard. He had managed to grip his gun, but was flapping his mouth soundlessly as he failed to do more than that with it. Rip watched the panicked man for a second before shooting him a second time in the face as well. So far, the rescue mission had been going remarkably well, but he knew that couldn't hold up for much longer. There had been too much luck involved in everything so far, and luck never lasted forever. Taking the hunting knife to their throats, he quickly stripped them of anything useful and dragged the bodies to a dark corner of the alley. According to what Jesse the plumber had told him, there had been 10 people. Assuming they hadn't recruited anyone from the island, then that meant there were 6 people that he still needed to contend with inside guarding Ashley. It was a decent number of people to deal with for sure, and he would have been more comfortable with the number if he hadn't been out of practice. However, it might just be doable if he was careful and nothing unlucky happened. Even he knew that was asking for a lot. There was a reason you always made multiple plans and then went with the one that assumed everything had gone wrong. Rip checked the remaining number of darts in the magazine and tossed it to the side when he saw that there was only one left in it. He had one in the chamber, which meant that if it had been full when he took it from the men, then it only held 6 shots. That wasn't a lot by any means, but the darts took up a little bit more room than a regular 9mm bullet might have. Carefully opening the door that the 2 men had been guarding, Rip snuck inside and closed it behind him. Within seconds of entering, it was obvious that something was wrong. The voices of what were more than 6 men could be heard quietly arguing in a room near the center of the building. The building wasn't large, but it had once been an office space of some sort. There were closed rooms and hallways scattered throughout the place. It made hiding tricky when someone could pop up around the corner at any time. The time for being sneaky had almost come to an end, and he still hadn't found out if Ashley was even here. He double-checked the magazines in his pistol and the rifle strapped to his backpack. If it came down to a firefight, he wanted to be ready. It was why he had been taking the guns from the men. It was generally faster to switch weapons than it was to reload. The exception was if you were familiar with the gun and had been using it for a while. At that point, someone typically knew the ins and outs of the gun and could swap magazines in seconds. It would still be slightly quicker to grab a fresh, loaded gun, but the difference became less extreme. Of course, all of that depended on where and how you had everything placed on your person. If you had the magazines stuffed in your pockets and the guns in your waistband, there was always going to be a clear difference between the two. He was using unfamiliar guns and would be swapping them out as needed. He tucked the second dart gun into the back of his pants and stored the magazines for them along the back of the magazine belt and in his pockets. With that, he was as ready as he was going to get.